the man who sold a country that didn't exist in September of 1822. A ship slowly pulled away from the docks of London. Standing on its deck were men, women, and children who believed they were leaving behind the uncertainty of Europe for a better life in the Americas. Some had sold their homes, others had closed their businesses, packed their belongings, and invested nearly everything they owned in the journey. They carried tools, clothing, furniture, medicine, and official-looking documents proving that land was waiting for them. Inside their pockets were banknotes from their new country, a country called Poyais. According to everything they had been told, Poyais was a growing nation on the coast of Central America. It had a capital city, it had government buildings, paved roads, fertile farmland, and rivers filled with gold. The climate was said to be pleasant. The soil was described as so rich that farmers could harvest several crops every year. New settlers were promised beautiful homes, important government positions, and opportunities they could never have imagined back in Britain. There was only one problem. The country they were traveling to did not exist, and the man who had sold them this dream was waiting safely thousands of miles away. His name was Gregor MacGregor. Gregor MacGregor was born in Scotland in 1786. As a young man, he joined the British Army and developed a reputation for being ambitious, confident, and extremely interested in social status. MacGregor did not simply want to be successful, he wanted to be seen as important. He enjoyed military uniforms, impressive titles, and the respect that came with appearing powerful. After leaving the British Army, MacGregor traveled to South America, where several colonies were fighting for independence from Spain. He joined revolutionary forces and participated in military campaigns across the region. Some of those campaigns ended in victory, others ended in confusion, retreat, and disaster. But MacGregor became skilled at presenting his experiences in the most impressive way possible. When he succeeded, he made sure everyone heard about it. When he failed, he usually found someone else to blame. Over time, he began introducing himself as a decorated military hero. To people back in Britain, South America seemed distant, mysterious, and full of opportunity. News traveled slowly, and very few people could easily verify MacGregor's claims. That distance gave him power. By the time MacGregor returned to Britain, he had developed the appearance of a respected soldier and international leader. He wore expensive clothing. He attended important social events. He spoke confidently about politics, war, trade, and the future of Central America. Then he made an extraordinary announcement. Gregor MacGregor claimed that while traveling in Central America, he had been granted control over a large territory on the Mosquito coast. He called the territory Poyais. MacGregor did not describe Poyais as an undeveloped stretch of coastline covered by thick forest. He described it as a functioning country. He gave himself the title of Cazique of Poyais, meaning that he was the nation's ruler. He claimed that Poyais had its own government, military, economy, and legal system. He spoke of a capital city called St. Joseph. According to MacGregor, St. Joseph was filled with elegant buildings, busy streets, banks, theaters, and government offices. He claimed that ships could enter a thriving harbor and unload goods from around the world. The surrounding countryside, he said, contained rich farmland and valuable natural resources. Investors could make fortunes. Ordinary families could become wealthy landowners. Professionals, such as doctors, teachers, bankers, and craftsmen, could receive important positions in the new country. It sounded like the opportunity of a lifetime. But MacGregor understood that a great lie could not survive on words alone. It needed evidence, and so he began building an entire nation out of paper. Maps of Poyais were printed and distributed. Land certificates were created. Official government documents appeared. Poyaisian currency was produced. A detailed guidebook described the country's geography, government, economy, wildlife, and major settlements. The guidebook explained what settlers should bring and what they could expect when they arrived. Everything looked official. The documents carried signatures, stamps, seals, and formal language. To an ordinary person in the 1820s, there was no internet, no satellite photography, and no quick way to contact someone living in Central America. A printed map from a respected office could feel like proof. A government document could feel undeniable. And if banks, investors, and other educated people appeared to believe in Poyais, why should an ordinary family question it? MacGregor began selling land. For a relatively small investment, buyers could own large areas in the new country. He also raised money by selling government bonds. Investors were told they were lending money to a developing nation and would receive interest in return. Poyais appeared to be entering the international financial system just like any other country. MacGregor opened offices and employed representatives. Public meetings were organized. Advertisements were published. Potential settlers were told that the nation urgently needed skilled workers. Doctors were needed to care for the population. Teachers were needed for schools. Soldiers were needed for defense. Merchants were needed to open stores. Government officials were needed to manage the growing country. Every position made Poyais sound more real. After all, why would a country need doctors, teachers, bankers, and officials unless people were already living there? Soon, families began preparing to leave Britain. Some believed they were escaping poverty. Some wanted adventure. Others saw Poyais as a place where they could finally own land and build something for their children. Before departing, many settlers exchanged their British money for Poyaisian currency. The banknotes were beautifully printed. They looked valuable. But outside MacGregor's offices, they were nothing more than decorated pieces of paper. In September 1822, the first group of settlers departed aboard a ship called the Honduras Packet. A second ship followed several months later. Together, approximately 250 people began the long journey across the Atlantic. Imagine what that voyage must have felt like. For weeks, the passengers lived in crowded conditions, surrounded by ocean. Parents comforted frightened children. Farmers discussed the land they would soon own. Business owners planned the shops they would open. Government appointees imagined the offices they would manage. Every difficult day at sea brought them closer to the future MacGregor had promised. They expected that when they reached Poyais, officials would welcome them at the harbor. They expected transportation, housing, and supplies. They expected to see the capital city rising near the coast. Then, after crossing the Atlantic, the settlers finally saw land. The ships approached the Mosquito coast. Passengers crowded onto the deck. They searched the shoreline for buildings. They looked for docks, roads, flags, and government representatives. But there was no welcoming crowd. There were no buildings. There was no developed harbor. There were no paved streets. There was no capital city. All they could see was an undeveloped coastline and dense forest. At first, many believed there had been a mistake. Perhaps they had landed in the wrong place. Perhaps the city was located farther inland. Perhaps government officials were already traveling to meet them. The settlers unloaded their belongings and waited. But no officials came. As the days passed, the truth became harder to ignore. The promised homes did not exist. The farms were not ready. The stores were not open. The government buildings were nowhere to be found. There was no functioning country waiting for them. They had arrived with paper money that could buy nothing and land certificates that offered no protection from the wilderness. The settlers attempted to build shelters using whatever materials they could find. Supplies began disappearing quickly. Food became limited. The environment was unfamiliar, hot, and filled with insects. Many of the settlers had no experience surviving in such conditions. They had prepared to join an established colony. They had not prepared to create one from nothing. Disease soon began spreading through the camp. People weakened from hunger and exhaustion. Medicine was limited. Families who had crossed the ocean dreaming of wealth were now struggling simply to remain alive. Each day, the illusion of Poyais disappeared a little more. The printed maps could not protect them. The official titles could not feed them. The Poyaisian banknotes could not purchase medicine. The impressive government documents meant nothing on an empty coastline. Eventually, passing ships and nearby communities learned about the settlers' situation. Survivors were rescued and taken to safer locations. But by then, many people had already died. Of the approximately 250 settlers who sailed toward Poyais, only a small number eventually returned safely to Britain. They returned sick, traumatized, and financially ruined. They brought stories of an empty shore where a prosperous country was supposed to have stood. News of the disaster spread. People began asking how one man had convinced investors, professionals, and entire families to believe in a fictional nation. By the time the full truth became known, Gregor MacGregor was no longer in Britain. He had traveled to France, and incredibly, he attempted to begin the scheme again. MacGregor continued selling land and recruiting settlers for Poyais, but French authorities became suspicious. They investigated the operation and arrested him. MacGregor was eventually placed on trial. One might expect that the deaths of settlers, the false documents, and the imaginary promises would have guaranteed his conviction. But the case was complicated. There really was a territory connected to the name Poyais. MacGregor argued that he had the authority to develop it. He could claim that the settlement had failed because of poor organization, dishonest representatives, or circumstances beyond his control. Proving that MacGregor had personally intended to deceive every investor was more difficult than it appeared. He was eventually acquitted. Gregor MacGregor walked free. Even more surprisingly, some of the people who had lost money continued to defend him. They found it easier to believe that MacGregor's employees had betrayed him than to accept that the impressive leader they trusted had invented nearly everything. This reaction reveals one of the most powerful parts of MacGregor's deception. He did not build Poyais with a single lie. He built it with hundreds of connected details. There was not just a story. There were maps. There was currency. There were government bonds. There were land certificates. There was a guidebook. There were offices, employees, public events, and ships carrying real settlers. Each new piece of evidence appeared to confirm all the others. A person might question a strange country mentioned during a conversation, but when that country had money, maps, government documents, and investors, questioning it became more difficult. MacGregor also understood that people often look to one another when deciding what is true. Investors saw other investors purchasing bonds. Settlers saw other families preparing for the journey. Professionals saw doctors, teachers, soldiers, and merchants accepting positions. Everyone assumed that someone else must have confirmed the facts, but almost no one had. Gregor MacGregor was not simply selling land. He was selling hope. To poor families, he sold the hope of financial security. To ambitious professionals, he sold the hope of status. To investors, he sold the hope of enormous profits. To adventurers, he sold the hope of discovering a new world. And once people had invested their money, reputation, and dreams in Poyais, admitting the truth became painful. MacGregor continued promoting versions of the Poyais project for years, although it never again reached the same level of success. Eventually, he returned to Venezuela, where he was able to live quietly and receive recognition for his earlier military service. He died in 1845. The imaginary country he created disappeared with him, but the methods he used never disappeared. The story of Poyais is not only about one dishonest man in the 1820s, it is a warning about how deception works. The most believable lies are often surrounded by small pieces of truth. MacGregor had genuinely traveled through Central America. He had genuinely participated in military campaigns. There really was land on the Mosquito coast. Ships really did sail there. But around those truths, he constructed an entire fictional world. He understood that confidence could appear more convincing than evidence. He understood that official-looking documents could silence doubt. And he understood that when enough people believe something, their belief becomes part of the illusion. Gregor MacGregor did something few criminals in history had ever attempted. He did not counterfeit a single banknote. He created an entire currency. He did not forge one property document. He sold land across a fictional nation. He did not impersonate one government official. He invented a government and made himself its ruler. For a brief and devastating moment, Poyais existed. It existed inside guidebooks. It existed on maps. It existed in financial offices. It existed in the dreams of families crossing the Atlantic. But when those families stepped onto the shore, reality was waiting for them. There was no capital. There was no government. There was no prosperous nation. There was only wilderness, worthless paper, and the consequences of believing a man who had turned imagination into one of history's most dangerous financial schemes. Gregor MacGregor had sold them a country, and all they received was a lie.